Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith. Thanks for joining us today as we dive into the fourth episode of our 5-part series on Abraham. Today's focus is on a particularly fascinating question. Is the account of Abraham's defeat of the Mesopotamian kings, as described in Genesis 14, 1-16, historically reliable? This story is not just a tale of ancient warfare. It's a narrative packed with significance. In our episode today, we will explore some critical questions. How does the documentary hypothesis challenge the traditional view of the biblical text? What significance do the names and places mentioned in Genesis 14 hold? How does the archaeological evidence support or contradict the biblical narrative? And finally, what lessons can we draw from this ancient story? As always, I'll present various perspectives from my research and conclude with my own thoughts. If you're interested in digging deeper, you'll find links to all our sources in the show notes. So are you ready to unravel this biblical mystery? Let's dive in and learn together. Before we get started, I want to read today's scripture from Genesis 14, 1-16. Bear with me, as this passage includes some rather difficult names, but it's essential to grasp the full scope of Abraham's victory over multiple kings. And again, we will refer to him as Abraham for clarity's sake. Genesis 14, 1-16 from the New Living Translation. About this time, war broke out in the region. King Amraphel of Babylonia, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim fought against King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemeber of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, also called Zoar. This second group of kings joined forces in the Siddim Valley, that is, the Valley of the Dead Sea. For 12 years, they had been subject to King Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled against him. 1 year later, Chedorlaomer and his allies arrived and defeated the Rephaites at Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzites at Ham, the Emites at Shavah Kiriataim, and the Horites at Mount Seir, as far as El Paran at the edge of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, now called Kadesh, and conquered all of the territory of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, living in Hazazon Tamar. Then the rebel kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle in the Valley of the Dead Sea. They fought against King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Babylonia, and King Arioch of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. As it happened, the Valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits, and as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into the tar pits, while the rest escaped into the mountains. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all of the spoils of the war and food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abraham's nephew who lived in Sodom, and carried off everything he owned. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abraham the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Aner, were Abraham's allies. When Abraham heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Then he pursued Chedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. There he divided his men and attacked during the night. Chedorlaomer's army fled, but Abraham chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abraham recovered all of the goods that had been taken, and he brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions and all of the women and other captives. All right, to me, this passage vividly describes a coalition of kings, a daring night raid, and a miraculous victory by Abraham. However, how much of this story can we consider to be historically reliable? The towns and names mentioned weren't all accurate during Abraham's time, but were accurate during the time when the story was written. This is similar to describing Hernando de Soto, who arrived in what is now Tampa Bay, Florida in 1539 and explored what is now Georgia in 1540. Although those names didn't exist during de Soto's exploration, we use them for clarity. To begin, let's discuss the broader historical context. The period in which this event supposedly took place is traditionally associated with the second millennium BC, a time when city-states in Mesopotamia, Canaan, and the surrounding regions frequently engaged in warfare over resources and territory. The names mentioned, Amraphel, Arioch, Kedorlaomer, and Tidal, are linked to various regions within Mesopotamia, which was a dominant cultural and political force at the time. All right, so let's define our problem, and we start here with the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. And they write, Genesis presents this battle as factually true, but according to the documentary hypothesis of biblical criticism, this story is a later addition and totally fictitious. All right, back to me. The authors here just dropped a term, the documentary hypothesis of biblical criticism, with no explanation. So let's briefly explore the documentary hypothesis. This theory, as many of you may already know, suggests that the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah, were not authored by a single person, traditionally believed to be Moses, but were instead compiled from 4 distinct sources. These sources, identified as the Yahwist, J, Elohist, E, Deuteronomist, D, and Priestly, P, sources, were combined over time to form the text that we have today. According to the proponents of the documentary hypothesis, Genesis 14 might belong to one of these sources, potentially even a later edition. This view posits that the story could have been crafted to serve a particular theological or political agenda rather than to record an actual historical event. The names and places might have been selected to create a narrative that fit within the broader theological framework of the Israelites. While the documentary hypothesis was dominant for much of the 20th century, it has been challenged now by more recent scholarship. Some argue that the theory oversimplifies the complex process of how these texts were compiled. Others suggest that while there may have been multiple sources, they were woven together much earlier than the documentary hypothesis suggests, possibly even by a single inspired author. Interestingly, we have another first of the Bible mentions in the scripture reading today. This battle also holds the distinction of being the first recorded instance of human warfare in the Bible. One aspect of the story that often sparks discussion is the figure of Abraham himself. Here we have a semi-nomadic leader who, with just 318 men, manages to defeat a coalition of 4 kings. This has led some to view the story as legendary, emphasizing the miraculous intervention of God in Abraham's life. However, others suggest that the story demonstrates Abraham's strategic acumen and the loyalty of his allies, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner. So, let's start by looking for a potential solution from the Big Book of Bible Difficulties. And they write, we possess very little information about this period apart from Genesis itself. As a result, while we do not have direct archaeological confirmation, there is no good reason to doubt the event. Such doubt usually stems from an anti-biblical bias. Furthermore, there is indirect support for the validity of this account. Noted archaeologist W.F. Albright, in a 1954 book, Old Testament Commentary, has observed that in spite of our failure hitherto to fix the historical horizon of chapter 14, we may be certain that its contents are very ancient. There are several words and expressions found nowhere else in the Bible and are now known to belong to the second millennium BC. The names of the towns in Transjordania are also known to be very ancient. In light of this, there is no good reason to doubt the authenticity of the biblical account of Abraham's battle with these Mesopotamian kings. Now, outside of the documentary hypothesis, there are other problems scholars note. For instance, in a 2021 article, Genesis 14, Abraham and the 4 Kings, by Mary Jane Shano, She writes, and I quote, "The story is almost monotonous in its detail of names and places, none of which can be verified by outside biblical sources. This makes scholars nervous. It raises many unnerving questions about the historicity of the whole chapter, like maybe it really isn't true after all," close quote. And in another vein, others try to make this story a case for the numerology of Jesus Christ. See if you can follow the logic here from Robert Bradshaw from his 1999 book, Creationism and the Early Church, Chapter 1, The Use and Abuse of Church History, where he writes, and I quote, "In some cases, numerological arguments were taken to the extreme. For example, in the apocryphal Epistle of Barnabas, Abraham's 318 servants, that's Genesis 14:14, are interpreted as prefiguring the cross of Christ. This is done by first interpreting 318 as 300 plus 10 plus 8. Next, the numbers 10 and 8 are seen as denoting the letters I and H, the initials for Jesus, and 300 is denoted by T, which resembles a cross," close quote. Did you get any of that? My head hurts just trying to follow this pattern. Let's continue digging. Surprisingly again, the New Revised Standard Version Bible does offer an interesting commentary on how this event fulfilled Scripture. They write, "In a fulfillment of the curse of Noah, predicting the enslavement of Canaan by Shem," and this is Genesis 9:26, "these Canaanite kings had been subject for 12 years to an eastern alliance of kings headed by the Shemite king," close quote. That being said, there is one substantial article that answers a number of our questions today. I'll summarize some of the findings from Uncovering the Battle That Changed the World with the really interesting subtitle, "Long Before Sparta's 300, There Was Abraham's 318, by Christopher Eames on November 30th, 2020. Eames writes, "What caused this dramatic power shift? Going further, could the rise of the Mesopotamian Amorites have anything to do with Abram's victory over Elam in Syria, a victory for the Western Amorites within whose country Abram lived, and whose people Kedorlaomer attacked?" We read that in Genesis 14:7 and 13. Could the biblical account of the defeat and humiliation of Elam have tipped the dominoes toward a complete collapse of the primary Mesopotamian power, eventually to be replaced entirely by an Amorite power? It's possible that Hammurabi's emergence as Mesopotamia's dominant force was a function of Abram's victory over King Kedorlaomer and his allies. So where does this evidence leave us? Details remain unknown. Crucially, though, there is no evidence against the Genesis 14 Battle of Nations, only a burgeoning body of evidence for it. Again, this is a really interesting article and worth your time to read. Brian Wendell, from his July 16th, 2021 article, Top 10 Discoveries Related to Abraham, writes this: "There are numerous elements of this battle in the biblical text which accurately reflect conditions in the patriarchal era, indicating its antiquity and not that this was invented over a millennium later, as those who hold to the documentary hypothesis suggest. First, names that are similar to the kings in this account have been found in other Mesopotamian texts from this period. Secondly, after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur in the late 3rd millennium BC, the area was not dominated by a single power. Large and small city-states with ever-changing political alliances controlled localized areas. Thus, this passage accurately reflects the geopolitical situation of the patriarchal era." Price and Holden conclude, "The antiquity of this account within the larger context of the patriarchal narratives indicates that there is substantial reason to regard the whole as historically accurate." Back to me. Price and Holden have written extensively on this in multiple books from 2017 and 2019. So, in conclusion, while the account of Abraham's defeat of the Mesopotamian kings in Genesis 14 is subject to skepticism, especially from proponents of the documentary hypothesis, it holds substantial credibility when viewed through the lens of current archaeological and biblical scholarship. The ancient linguistic elements, the geopolitical context, and the historical plausibility collectively suggest that the story is more than just a legend. It may indeed be rooted in a genuine historical event. Next week, we'll wrap up this series on Abraham with the 5th episode, focusing on Genesis 14:18 through 20. We'll be tackling another intriguing question. Who was Melchizedek? The mysterious figure that puzzled scholars for centuries, so you won't want to miss it. As always, we love hearing from our listeners. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well. And also write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, or any of your venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.